In the last video, we went over a portion of the physical evidence to disprove NISD's fire-induced collapse theory, and then we went over a small portion of the evidence for controlled demolition, as well as some of the evidence for thermite. The pools of molten steel at ground zero, the fires burning underground for 99 days, and the video evidence of thermite dripping from the South Tower are all examples of solid physical evidence for the use of thermite. But there's one final piece of evidence that we need in order to put the last nail in the coffin and lay this thing to rest for good. When thermite reacts, it produces aluminum oxide, visible as white smoke, and molten iron. When thermite reacts, it often sprays molten iron into the air. This spray of molten iron forms round droplets from surface tension, which solidify as tiny iron spheres. So if thermite was really used to bring down the World Trade Center, we would find evidence of these iron microspheres in the dust. Also, if thermite were used in a linear shaped cutting charge to sever core columns, the explosives at the center would have blasted the molten iron from the thermite on the outside into the air, atomizing it into tiny droplets and sending them flying everywhere. So we'd find really small microspheres of iron. So we need these tiny microspheres in order to scientifically prove this theory of thermite. Well, fortunately, there were people who collected dust samples from the World Trade Center and saved them for sentimental value or whatever reason. Jeanette McKinley's apartment was directly across from the World Trade Center's South Tower when it collapsed, and she saved some of the dust that blew all over her apartment. She later provided the dust to Dr. Stephen Jones of Brigham Young's University for testing. By using a plastic bag placed over the magnet, Jones was able to extract these iron microspheres from the dust and had them analyzed to determine their composition. The graph on the left shows the iron-rich microspheres that were extracted from the World Trade Center dust sample provided by Jeanette McKinley. The graph on the right is what thermite should look like. The two are almost indistinguishable. So does this scientifically prove the use of thermite? Well, let's look at some of the debunking arguments. Could these iron-rich microspheres, which are spectrographically identical to reacted thermite, have been produced by cutting torches during cleanup? Well, seeing as the dust samples were taken from Jeanette McKinley's apartment across from the World Trade Center, it would seem pretty unlikely for any kind of torch slag to have wound up inside of her apartment from the cleanup workers outside of her building. This also can't explain the chemical signatures. If these microspheres were produced by melting steel with a cutting torch, they would have traces of manganese and carbon, which are steel additives. Molten iron is a byproduct of thermite. Iron, not steel. It may look the same as molten steel to you and I, but chemically they are not the same thing, chemically. Chemistry and physics are not biased. Chemistry and physics are not left-wing liberals. They are facts. Now let's deal with them accordingly. If thermite incendiary cutter charges are what really brought down the World Trade Center, then we need to ask ourselves, how did they get there? Who put them there? Is this scenario even likely? How does the probability of this scenario compare with the probability offered by the government as an explanation? NIST admits that World Trade Center 7 had only a low probability of collapse from fire, but just how low is it? It also seems highly unlikely that the 9/11 was really a government conspiracy. I mean, let's be honest. What are the chances of that happening and them getting away with it? How many people would have to be involved, and why aren't any of them talking? So let's look at some probabilities and see how they compare. Have there ever been any actual real conspiracies before? Has anyone ever committed arson and insurance fraud by destroying their own building before? Has a government ever destroyed its own building as a political move? Did they actually get away with blaming it on someone else? Is it possible to use propaganda and control of the mainstream media to mislead an entire nation? Is it possible to rig the World Trade Center for demolition without people noticing? I mean, these are all probabilities we would need to consider for an inside job theory to work, correct? For the government's theory to work, they need to prove that 3 World Trade Center buildings collapsed from fire for the first time in history, which is why they hired a bunch of their guys, gave them NIST credentials, and had them bullshit a report. So we're going to weigh these probabilities against each other on a scale of which is more likely. If something has never happened before, it holds no weight. If we have an historical example to compare it to, then it holds some weight. Well, let's see which side the scale of probability rules in favor of. On the conspiracy side, we have a series of unlikely events, but they all have historical examples we can compare them to. On the government side, however, we have a series of highly improbable events, including 3 consecutive unique events. So it's not just the possibility of a steel skyscraper disintegrating from fire, falling straight down into the path of most resistance. We have to explain why it happened 3 times in the same day, in the same place, when we've never seen a building collapse like this before anywhere. So why can it only happen in New York City on 9/11 and not anywhere else? I mean, we have over 100 years of steel frame buildings being constructed in the world, and this has never happened to a single one of them. Now that we've seen what chemistry and physics and mathematics and probability say about conspiracy theories, we're going to tie it all together and play a part of a covert ops demolition engineer. Heck, we've already got one who agrees with us. There are probably more out there too who aren't coming forward. Now we are tasked with Mission Impossible. We have to rig these buildings in such a way so that an airplane can hit them, burn for at least an hour, and then make them collapse and look like planes could have done the whole thing. The collapses have to initiate from the impact point of the plane downwards, continuing straight to the ground. Detonation cord is out of the question, so we'll have to use remote detonators. In order to do this, we are going to need about a month's worth of 24-hour access to the buildings. Nobody can gain access to these buildings without the approval of World Trade Center security. They give the final approval, so we'll need the assistance of the property manager as well to vacate floors, to shift tenants around as the work is performed in secret on different sections of the building. Now, the World Trade Center is basically 3 office buildings stacked on top of one another. There are 2 sky lobbies where elevators get off. These are the most structurally reinforced areas of the building, and they are the hardest to get to because there are always people around working. So we'll need to do them last, and we'll have to do it while the buildings are evacuated because it's going to be noisy. People tend to notice stuff like that and get suspicious. We could use a team of demolition workers and dress them as elevator repairmen and give them uniforms. This way they have an excuse for doing work on the elevator shafts. All they have to do is cut through the drywall in order to access the steel girders to apply demolition charges to the core columns, with the detonators on the inside so that they wouldn't be damaged by burning fires on the outside of the core column. They'd be protected by the steel casing of the actual core column itself. Now, 4-foot crawl spaces between floor sections in the World Trade Center allows unrestricted access to the entire support infrastructure of these buildings, all through the elevator shafts. Now it's up to you to do the research and see for yourself if there are any facts or witness testimony from the people who were there in the World Trade Centers before this, and see if they have any stories that support any of this. And keep in mind that people can't see explosives that are hidden inside the walls. So think about it. This is your country. As Americans, we have every single right to know the truth about what happened that day. And I don't think the government's being honest. There's way too much scientific evidence that refutes everything that they have ever given to us. And the NIST report, FEMA report, all popular mechanics, these aren't scientific at all. They're bullshit. Please check all the links, do your research,